A wealthy businessman, Robert, humiliates an African-American family at a high-end restaurant, convinced of his own superiority. However, as he finishes his meal, the waiter hands him a note that unveils a startling truth. What is written on the note, and how will it alter Robert's life forever? Before we dive into the story, comment below where you're watching from today, and if you enjoy this story, don't forget to subscribe. Robert Hughes stepped out of his sleek black luxury car, handing the keys to the eager valet. The crisp evening air carried the faint aroma of gourmet cuisine from the Golden Plate, his favorite upscale restaurant. A satisfied smile played on his lips as he straightened his designer suit and strolled towards the entrance. The doorman, recognizing Robert immediately, rushed to open the heavy glass door. "Good evening, Mr. Hughes," he said with a respectful nod. Robert barely acknowledged the greeting, sweeping past into the warm, dimly lit interior. The soft classical music and gentle clink of silverware against fine china created a soothing atmosphere. He breathed in deeply, savoring the exclusivity that surrounded him. The maitre d', a tall man with graying hair, hurried over. "Mr. Hughes, what a pleasure to see you this evening. Your usual table is ready, sir." "Excellent," Robert replied, his tone conveying that he expected nothing less. As he followed the maitre d' to his preferred corner table, Robert's eyes roamed the dining room. He noted with satisfaction the other well-dressed patrons, all clearly people of means like himself. This was his world, where wealth and status reigned supreme. Settling into his seat, Robert accepted the menu with a curt nod. "The usual champagne to start, Henry," he instructed the hovering waiter. "Right away, Mr. Hughes," Henry replied, scurrying off to fulfill the request. Robert leaned back, a smug smile on his face. Here in the Golden Plate, he was royalty. The staff knew his preferences, anticipated his needs, and treated him with the reverence he believed he deserved. It was a stark contrast to the outside world, where people often failed to recognize his importance. As he perused the menu, Robert overheard snippets of conversation from nearby tables, talk of business deals, exotic vacations, and luxury purchases filled the air. He felt a sense of belonging, surrounded by those who understood the value of money and power. Henry returned with a chilled bottle of champagne, presenting it for Robert's approval before pouring a glass. The bubbles fizzed gently, catching the soft light from the crystal chandelier overhead. Robert settled into his usual table, the soft leather chair molding to his form. The waiter approached again, a crisp white napkin draped over his arm. "Good evening, Mr. Hughes. What will you be having tonight?" Robert barely glanced at the menu. "The usual filet mignon, medium rare." "Excellent choice, sir." The waiter nodded, jotting down the order. As the waiter retreated, Robert's attention was drawn to the restaurant's entrance. An African-American family, well-dressed and dignified, had just walked in. The father, a tall man with a kind face, held the door for his wife and young son. Robert's brow furrowed, his lips pressing into a thin line. He watched as the maitre d' greeted the family warmly, leading them to a table not far from his own. "What are they doing here?" Robert muttered under his breath, his eyes narrowing. He couldn't help but feel that their presence somehow diminished the exclusivity of the Golden Plate. The family settled into their seats, the little boy's eyes wide with wonder as he took in the elegant surroundings. His mother leaned in, whispering something that made him giggle. Robert's gaze lingered on them, his annoyance growing. He watched as the father, James Carter, ordered for the family with ease and confidence. The way the staff treated them with respect irked Robert even more. "They can't possibly afford this place," Robert thought to himself, his fingers drumming impatiently on the table. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were out of place, that they didn't belong in his world of wealth and privilege. As Robert's meal arrived, he found himself continually distracted by the Carter family. The sound of their quiet laughter grated on his nerves. He cut into his steak with more force than necessary, his enjoyment of the perfectly cooked meat diminished by his growing irritation. The evening wore on, and Robert couldn't help but steal glances at the family. He scrutinized their manners, their clothes, searching for any sign that would confirm his assumptions. But to his frustration, he found none. They carried themselves with grace and poise, seeming perfectly at ease in the upscale environment. As the Carters enjoyed their meal, Robert's irritation grew like a storm cloud. He couldn't tear his eyes away from them, his face twisted in a scowl. "Look at them," he muttered under his breath, loud enough for nearby diners to hear. "Acting like they belong here." A couple at the next table shifted uncomfortably, exchanging worried glances. Robert didn't notice, too focused on his perceived slight to the restaurant's atmosphere. "I bet they're using a credit card they can't afford to pay off," Robert sneered, his voice rising slightly. He stabbed at his steak, the knife scraping against the plate with an unpleasant screech. The waiter approached the Carter table, smiling warmly. "Good evening. May I start you off with some drinks?" James Carter nodded, his voice pleasant and assured. "Yes, we'll have a bottle of the house red, please." Robert scoffed loudly. "House red? Figures they go for the cheapest option." The tension in the room began to build. Other diners were now openly staring at Robert, their faces a mix of shock and disapproval. A woman at a nearby table leaned over to her husband, whispering, "Someone should say something. This is awful." But the Carters remained blissfully unaware of the storm brewing around them. Sarah helped Jacob with his napkin, tucking it neatly into his collar. The boy's eyes were wide with excitement as he took in the elegant surroundings. "Look, Mommy," Jacob whispered, pointing discreetly at the crystal chandelier above them. "It's so sparkly." Sarah smiled, running a hand through her son's hair. "It sure is, sweetie. Isn't this place magical?" Their joy was palpable, a stark contrast to the dark cloud of Robert's disdain. As the waiter returned with their wine, Robert's condescending attitude became even more apparent. "I can't believe they're letting just anyone in here now," he grumbled loud enough for half the restaurant to hear. "This used to be an exclusive establishment." The other patrons were now visibly uncomfortable, some shooting sympathetic glances at the Carter family, others glaring at Robert. But James, Sarah, and Jacob remained focused on each other, their faces lit up with happiness as they perused the menu together, completely oblivious to Robert's hateful remarks. Jonathan, the waiter, approached Robert's table with a silver tray balanced expertly on his palm. "Your appetizer, Mr. Hughes," he said, placing a delicate plate of foie gras before the millionaire. Robert barely glanced at the dish, his eyes fixed on the Carter family. "Tell me, Jonathan," he said, his voice dripping with disdain, "how often do we get guests like that in here?" He jerked his head toward the Carters. Jonathan's smile faltered for a moment. "I'm not sure what you mean, sir. We welcome all guests at the Golden Plate. Come now," Robert pressed, his tone condescending. "You know what I'm talking about. People who clearly don't fit in with our usual clientele." The waiter shifted uncomfortably, his professional demeanor cracking slightly. "Sir, I don't think it's appropriate for me to comment on other guests," Robert snorted. "I suppose you're right. It's just surprising to see them here. I hope they can afford it without dipping into their rent money." Jonathan's face reddened. He tried to change the subject, gesturing to the plate. "How is your appetizer, Mr. Hughes? Is everything to your liking?" But Robert wasn't done. He leaned in, lowering his voice to a conspiratorial whisper. "I bet they're here on some sort of charity event. That's the only way they could afford a place like this, right?" Jonathan's discomfort was palpable now. He glanced around, hoping no one else could hear Robert's cruel remarks. "Sir, Perhaps we could discuss the wine selection for your main course." Robert waved his hand dismissively. "Oh, don't worry about that now. I'm more interested in how our esteemed establishment is maintaining its standards these days." The waiter stood rigid, caught between his duty to serve and his growing disgust at Robert's behavior. He opened his mouth to speak, but Robert cut him off. "Just look at them," Robert continued, his voice thick with contempt. "They probably think they're so special being here. I wonder if they even know how to use all the forks." As the Carter family began to eat their meal, Robert's frustration reached its boiling point. He could no longer contain his disdain for their presence in what he considered his exclusive domain. Suddenly, he burst into loud, mocking laughter that echoed through the elegant dining room. All eyes turned to Robert as he pointed a finger at the Carter family. "Look at them," he exclaimed, his voice dripping with derision. "How on earth did they manage to afford a place like this?" The other diners gasped in shock, their forks clattering against fine china as they stared at the unfolding scene. Robert's face was flushed red, his eyes wild with a mix of anger and amusement. "I bet they sold their car just to eat here tonight," Robert continued, his voice growing louder and more offensive with each passing moment. "Or maybe they're lost. Did you take a wrong turn at the drive-thru?" The Carter family exchanged uneasy glances, their faces a mixture of confusion and hurt. James Carter placed a protective hand on his son Jacob's shoulder, while Sarah tried to maintain a calm demeanor. They chose not to respond to Robert's taunts, instead focusing on their meals and each other. Robert, emboldened by the attention he was receiving, stood up from his chair. He swayed slightly, the effects of his earlier drinks becoming apparent. "Come on, tell us your secret," he shouted at the Carters. "Did you win the lottery, or are you here on some sort of charity case?" The restaurant had fallen completely silent except for Robert's voice. Waiters stood frozen, unsure of how to handle the situation. Other patrons looked on in horror, some averting their eyes in embarrassment, others glaring at Robert in disgust. Despite the growing tension, the Carter family remained composed. They continued their meal with as much dignity as they could muster, refusing to give Robert the satisfaction of a response. Despite Robert's offensive behavior, the Carter family's grace under pressure was remarkable. They chose to ignore his provocations, focusing instead on their meal and each other. James gently squeezed his wife's hand, offering her a reassuring smile. Sarah, in turn, stroked Jacob's hair, whispering words of comfort to their young son. The contrast between Robert's arrogance and the family's dignity was stark. While Robert continued his tirade, the Carters engaged in quiet conversation, their voices low and steady. They laughed softly at Jacob's joke, their eyes twinkling with genuine warmth. Other patrons in the restaurant couldn't help but overhear Robert's mocking tone and impolite remarks. His words hung heavy in the air, creating an uncomfortable atmosphere that spread from table to table. Diners exchanged worried glances, their own meals forgotten as they watched the scene unfold. As the minutes ticked by, a shift began to occur in the restaurant. The initial shock of Robert's outburst gave way to something else: sympathy for the Carter family. People admired their dignity in the face of such unwarranted hostility. Whispers of support began to circulate among the tables. An elderly couple at a nearby table shook their heads in disapproval of Robert's conduct, and a young woman wiped away a tear, moved by the family's strength. Even the waitstaff, though trying to maintain their professional demeanor, couldn't hide their discomfort with Robert's behavior. The Carters' grace under pressure stood in sharp relief against Robert's continued rant. While he grew louder and more agitated, they remained calm, their posture relaxed and their faces serene. It was as if they were surrounded by a bubble of peace, untouched by the storm raging around them. Jonathan, the waiter, approached Robert's table carrying a tray with the main course. His hands trembled slightly as he set the plate down, aware of the tense atmosphere that had engulfed the restaurant. Robert, oblivious to the waiter's discomfort, continued his tirade against the Carter family. "Can you believe they're still here?" Robert sneered, gesturing toward the Carters with his fork. "People like that shouldn't be allowed in a place like this." Jonathan's face flushed with embarrassment, but he maintained his professional demeanor. "Is everything to your liking, sir?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Robert hardly acknowledged the question, his attention fixed on the family across the room. "I bet they can't even read the menu properly," he chuckled cruelly. "Probably just pointing at pictures." The waiter's discomfort was palpable as he tried to navigate the situation. He glanced around, noticing that all eyes in the restaurant were now focused on their table. The other diners watched with a mix of horror and fascination as Robert's behavior became increasingly offensive. Excusing himself, Jonathan made his way to the Carter family's table. As he approached, he could see the strain on their faces despite their attempts to remain composed. He leaned in close as he refilled their water glasses. "I'm so sorry about this," Jonathan murmured, his voice filled with genuine remorse. "Please know that we don't condone such behavior." James Carter gave a small nod of acknowledgement, his eyes conveying both gratitude and weariness. Sarah reached out and briefly touched Jonathan's arm, a silent gesture of thanks for his kindness. As Jonathan moved between tables, he could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him. He felt ashamed of Robert's conduct but powerless to intervene directly. The restaurant's policy of catering to wealthy regulars like Robert left him in an impossible position. As the evening progressed, Robert's behavior grew increasingly obnoxious. His loud, mocking laughter echoed through the restaurant, drawing disapproving glances from other diners. Yet, he remained oblivious to the impact of his actions, convinced that his wealth and status gave him the right to act however he pleased. "Look at them, trying to use the fancy silverware," Robert sneered, gesturing towards the Carter family with his wine glass. "It's like watching monkeys at a tea party." His cruel comments hung in the air, creating a toxic atmosphere in what was usually a refined setting. The other patrons shifted uncomfortably in their seats, exchanging worried glances. The gentle clinking of cutlery against fine china was now overshadowed by Robert's harsh voice and derisive chuckles. Despite the growing tension, the Carter family maintained their composure. James focused on cutting his steak, his jaw clenched tightly. Sarah engaged Jacob in quiet conversation, trying to distract him from the unpleasant situation. Their dignity in the face of such blatant disrespect was apparent to everyone in the restaurant, everyone except Robert. At a nearby table, an elderly couple whispered to each other, their faces etched with concern. A young woman dining alone kept glancing nervously between Robert and the Carters, her meal forgotten. Even a group of businessmen, who had been engrossed in a lively discussion earlier, now spoke in hushed tones, their eyes darting towards Robert's table. The atmosphere in the restaurant had transformed from one of elegant dining to uncomfortable tension. The soft background music seemed to fade away, drowned out by Robert's persistent mockery and the growing unease of the other patrons. As the Carters finished their meal, James gently dabbed his mouth with a napkin and caught Jonathan's eye. With a subtle nod, he signaled for the waiter. The restaurant had grown eerily quiet, the usual chatter of diners replaced by a tense silence. Everyone seemed to be holding their breath, waiting to see how this uncomfortable evening would conclude. Robert, still oblivious to the discomfort he had caused, continued to mutter under his breath, his eyes fixed on the Carter family. The other patrons glanced nervously between Robert and the Carters, their own meals forgotten in the face of the unfolding drama. Jonathan approached the Carter table, his steps measured and careful. As he arrived at the table, he met James's eyes, silently conveying his apology for the evening's events. "Thank you, Jonathan," James said softly, his voice steady despite the strain of the evening. "The meal was excellent." Sarah smiled warmly at Jonathan, her grace undiminished by Robert's cruel remarks. Little Jacob, sensing the tension but not fully understanding it, looked up at the waiter with innocent curiosity. As the Carters prepared to depart, Robert savored the last bites of his gourmet meal, a smug smile playing across his lips. He felt satisfied, not just with the exquisite food, but with his own perceived superiority. The restaurant had quieted down, the tension from earlier still lingering in the air like a heavy fog. Jonathan approached Robert's table with his usual professional demeanor. "I hope you enjoyed your meal, sir," he said politely, his voice betraying no hint of the discomfort from earlier. As he cleared away the empty plates, Jonathan discreetly slipped a folded piece of paper onto the crisp white tablecloth. Robert barely glanced at the note, assuming it was nothing more than his bill. "Just leave it there," he said dismissively, waving his hand. "I'll take care of it shortly." Jonathan nodded and retreated, leaving Robert alone with the mysterious note. As he sipped his after-dinner cognac, Robert's eyes kept darting to the folded paper. Curiosity began to gnaw at him. What if it wasn't just the bill? What if Jonathan had left him some sort of message? Unable to resist any longer, Robert reached for the note with manicured fingers. He unfolded it carefully, his eyebrows furrowing as he began to read. As his eyes scanned the words, the color drained from his face. The note revealed a shocking truth. The Carter family, whom Robert had so cruelly mocked throughout the evening, were not just wealthy. They were the owners of the Golden Plate. Not only that, but they owned several other successful businesses in town and were well-respected philanthropists who had recently returned from abroad. Robert's hand trembled as he reread the note, struggling to process the information. The implications of his behavior began to dawn on him, crashing over him like a tidal wave. He had spent the entire evening ridiculing and belittling the very people who owned this establishment, people who were not only his equals in wealth, but surpassed him in reputation and community standing. His earlier smugness evaporated, replaced by a sickening feeling in the pit of his stomach. Robert's eyes darted around the restaurant, suddenly aware of the disapproving glances from other patrons. The weight of his actions pressed down on him, leaving him feeling small and foolish. Robert sat frozen in his chair, his face a picture of anguish and regret. The bustling sounds of the restaurant faded into the background as he grappled with the enormity of his actions. His mind raced, replaying every cruel word and disdainful glance he had directed at the Carter family. "What have I done?" he whispered to himself, his voice barely audible. The weight of his mistakes pressed down on him, making it hard to breathe. Robert's hand shook as he reached for his water glass, desperate to quench his suddenly parched throat. As he sipped, he caught a glimpse of his reflection in the polished silverware. The man staring back at him was a stranger, arrogant, cruel, and small-minded. For the first time in years, Robert felt truly ashamed of himself. He had always prided himself on his success, his wealth, and his status, but now, faced with the consequences of his prejudice, he realized how hollow those achievements were. "I judged them based on nothing but my own assumptions," Robert thought, his stomach churning with guilt. "I didn't even give them a chance." He glanced around the restaurant, noticing for the first time the diverse mix of patrons enjoying their meals. How many times had he dismissed people based on their appearance or his preconceived notions? The thought made him feel sick. Robert's mind wandered to his own life, his values, and the way he had conducted himself. He had always believed that his wealth made him superior, that it gave him the right to look down on others. But now, faced with the grace and dignity of the Carter family, he saw how misguided and cruel that belief was. "I've been so wrong," Robert muttered, burying his face in his hands. "So terribly wrong." His carefully constructed world of superiority and entitlement began to crumble around him. In its place, a deep sense of guilt and remorse took root. Robert felt lost, unsure of who he was without the shield of his arrogance. As the reality of his behavior sank in, Robert knew he had to make amends. But how could he possibly make up for such a public display of prejudice and cruelty? The thought of facing the Carter family filled him with dread, but he knew he couldn't run from this. Robert took a deep breath, his legs trembling as he pushed himself up from his chair. The weight of his actions pressed down on him, but he knew he had to face the consequences. With slow, deliberate steps, he made his way across the restaurant floor toward the Carter family's table. As he approached, the buzz of conversation in the dining room faded to a hushed silence. All eyes turned to watch the unfolding scene. Robert could feel the stares boring into his back, but he kept his focus on the family before him. James, Sarah, and young Jacob looked up as Robert stopped at their table, their faces showing a mix of curiosity and weariness. Robert's heart pounded in his chest, his mouth dry as he struggled to find the right words. "Mr. and Mrs. Carter," he began, his voice shaky and barely above a whisper. Robert cleared his throat and tried again, louder this time. I owe you an apology." The silence in the restaurant was deafening. Robert could hear his own rapid breathing as he continued. "My behavior tonight was inexcusable. I made terrible assumptions about you and your family, and I acted in a way that was cruel and prejudiced." Robert's voice cracked with emotion as he spoke. "I was so caught up in my own arrogance that I couldn't see the truth. You showed incredible grace and dignity in the face of my rudeness, and I am deeply ashamed of my actions." Tears welled up in Robert's eyes as he looked at each member of the Carter family. "I know that words can't undo the hurt I've caused, but I want you to know how truly sorry I am. What I did was wrong, and I hope that someday I can make amends for my behavior." The Carters exchanged glances, their expressions unreadable. Robert stood there, vulnerable and exposed, waiting for their response. The entire restaurant held its breath, the tension palpable in the air. Robert's voice trembled as he continued his heartfelt apology. "I let my prejudice cloud my judgment," he said, his eyes brimming with tears. "I made assumptions about you based solely on your appearance, and that was wrong. I failed to see the wonderful people you are, and instead, I chose to be cruel and hurtful." The restaurant remained silent, every patron and staff member watching the scene unfold. Robert's shoulders slumped, his usual confident posture replaced by one of genuine remorse. "What I did was inexcusable," Robert went on, his voice barely above a whisper. "I can only imagine how my words and actions made you feel, and I'm truly sorry for any pain I've caused. Your family showed such grace and dignity in the face of my terrible behavior. I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I hope that you can find it in your hearts to give me a chance to make things right." James and Sarah Carter exchanged a glance, their expressions unreadable. Little Jacob looked up at his parents, then back at Robert, his young face a mix of confusion and curiosity. Robert took a deep breath, fighting back tears. "I understand if you can't forgive me right away. What I did was awful, and I know it will take time to heal the hurt I've caused. But I want you to know that this experience has opened my eyes. I see now how wrong I was, and I'm committed to changing my ways." The other diners watched in stunned silence as Robert, once so arrogant and superior, now stood before the Carter family, vulnerable and filled with regret. The contrast between his earlier behavior and his current state was stark, and it was clear to everyone that his remorse was genuine. Robert waited, his heart pounding, for the Carter family's response. The tension in the air was palpable as everyone in the restaurant held their breath, wondering how this unexpected scene would unfold. James Carter listened intently to Robert's apology, his face calm and composed. As Robert finished speaking, a hush fell over the restaurant. Everyone waited with bated breath to see how James would respond. After a long pause, James spoke, his voice steady and kind. "Mr. Hughes, I appreciate your apology. It takes courage to admit when we're wrong, and I can see that you're truly sorry for your actions." Robert's shoulders sagged with relief, but James wasn't finished. "However," James continued, "I want you to understand the harm that this kind of behavior can cause. When we judge others based on their appearance or make assumptions about their worth, we create a world of hurt and division." Robert nodded, his eyes downcast as he absorbed James's words. "Every person, regardless of their background or how they look, deserves to be treated with respect and dignity," James explained gently. "We all have stories, struggles, and successes that aren't visible on the surface. That's why it's so important to approach others with an open heart and mind." As James spoke, Robert felt the weight of his words sink deep into his heart. He realized how much pain his thoughtless actions could have caused. "The lesson here," James said, his voice growing stronger, "is that we should never judge a book by its cover. Each person we meet is a unique individual with their own worth and value. When we make snap judgments, we not only hurt others, but also miss out on the chance to learn and grow ourselves." Robert nodded again, feeling a mix of shame and gratitude. He was thankful for James's kindness in the face of his own cruelty. "I hope," James concluded, "that this experience will help you see the world and the people in it differently. We all have the power to create a more understanding and compassionate society, one interaction at a time." The restaurant remained silent as James's words hung in the air. Robert stood there, absorbing the powerful lesson he had just received. He felt a deep sense of regret for his past behavior, but also a glimmer of hope for the chance to become a better person. Robert listened intently to James's words, his heart heavy with the weight of the lesson. As James finished speaking, Robert felt a mix of shame and gratitude wash over him. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. Seeing Robert struggle, James softened his expression. "Mr. Hughes," he said gently, "I believe that every mistake is an opportunity for growth. That's why I'd like to extend an invitation to you." Robert's eyebrows raised in surprise. "An invitation?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. James nodded. "Yes, our family runs a foundation that focuses on helping the less fortunate and promoting equality and hard work. We're the main sponsors, but we're always looking for people who want to make a difference." Sarah Carter chimed in with a warm smile. "We believe that by working together, we can create real change in our community." Robert stood there, stunned by their kindness. He couldn't understand why they would offer him such an opportunity after how he had behaved. James continued, "We think that by participating in the Foundation's work, you could learn firsthand about the value of humility and the importance of treating others with respect. It's one thing to hear about it, but it's another to experience it yourself." Robert felt a lump form in his throat. He was deeply touched by their offer, yet he felt completely unworthy of it. I don't know what to say," he stammered. "After how I've acted, I don't deserve your kindness." "That's exactly why we're offering," Sarah said softly. "Everyone deserves a chance to learn and grow. We believe that this experience could be transformative for you." Robert looked from James to Sarah, then to young Jacob, who was watching the exchange with curious eyes. He felt overwhelmed by their generosity and the opportunity they were presenting him. I'm truly honored by your offer," Robert said, his voice thick with emotion. "But I'm not sure I'm worthy of such a chance." James placed a gentle hand on Robert's shoulder. "Mr. Hughes, worthiness isn't about what you've done in the past. It's about what you choose to do moving forward. We're offering you a chance to be part of something bigger than yourself, to make a real difference in people's lives." Robert stood there, his eyes welling with tears. The Carter family's kindness and forgiveness touched him deeply, stirring something within his heart that he hadn't felt in years. I don't know how to thank you," Robert said, his voice trembling. "Your offer is more than I deserve, but if you'll have me, I'd be honored to help with your foundation." James smiled warmly and extended his hand. "Welcome aboard, Mr. Hughes. We're glad to have you." As Robert shook James's hand, he felt a weight lift from his shoulders. The shame and regret he had been carrying began to transform into something new, hope and determination. Sarah spoke up, her voice gentle. "We have a meeting tomorrow afternoon at the community center. Would you like to join us?" Robert nodded eagerly. "Yes, I'd love to. Thank you." As the days passed, Robert threw himself into the foundation's work. He attended meetings, helped organize events, and even rolled up his sleeves to serve meals at the local soup kitchen. With each passing day, he felt his perspective shifting. One afternoon, as Robert helped paint a rundown community center alongside James, he paused and looked around. He saw people from all walks of life working together, laughing, and supporting one another. It was a far cry from the exclusive world he had once prized. "You know, James," Robert said, wiping sweat from his brow, "I used to think success was all about how much money you had or how important you seemed. But now I see things differently." James nodded, encouraging him to continue. "I realize now that true success isn't about what you have," Robert continued, his voice filled with emotion. "It's about the impact you have on others. It's about making a difference in people's lives." James smiled, patting Robert on the back. "That's a valuable lesson, Robert, and you're right. The most fulfilling success comes from lifting others up, not looking down on them." As Robert continued to work with the foundation, he found himself viewing the world through a new lens. He began to see the value in every person he met, regardless of their background or status. Compassion replaced competition in his heart, and he discovered a sense of fulfillment he had never known before. As Robert became more involved in the foundation's work, he found himself spending more time with the Carter family. Their kindness and wisdom began to chip away at the walls he had built around himself. One sunny morning, Robert joined Sarah Carter at a job training program for single mothers. As he helped set up chairs for the workshop, he overheard a young woman named Lisa talking about her struggles. "It's not easy," Lisa said, her voice filled with determination. "But I'm going to make a better life for my kids, no matter what it takes." Robert was struck by her resilience. He had never had to worry about providing for his family, and Lisa's strength humbled him. Later that week, Robert volunteered at a food bank with James. As they sorted donations, an elderly man approached them with tears in his eyes. "Thank you," the man said, his voice quivering. "This food, it means I can eat this week." Robert felt a lump form in his throat. He had never known true hunger, and the man's gratitude for something as simple as food touched him deeply. As the days turned into weeks, Robert found himself constantly surprised by the people he met through the foundation. He saw single parents working multiple jobs to support their children, immigrants learning English to build better lives, and teenagers tutoring younger kids to break the cycle of poverty. Seeing Robert struggle, James softened his expression. "Mr. Hughes," he said gently, "I believe that every mistake is an opportunity for growth. That's why I'd like to extend an invitation to you." Robert's eyebrows raised in surprise. "An invitation?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. James nodded. "Yes, our family runs a foundation that focuses on helping the less fortunate and promoting equality and hard work. We're the main sponsors, but we're always looking for people who want to make a difference." Sarah Carter chimed in with a warm smile. "We believe that by working together, we can create real change in our community." Robert stood there, stunned by their kindness. He couldn't understand why they would offer him such an opportunity after how he had behaved. James continued, "We think that by participating in the Foundation's work, you could learn firsthand about the value of humility and the importance of treating others with respect. It's one thing to hear about it, but it's another to experience it yourself. Robert felt a lump form in his throat. He was deeply touched by their offer, yet he felt completely unworthy of it. I don't know what to say, he stammered. After how I've acted, I don't deserve your kindness. That's exactly why we're offering, Sarah said softly. Everyone deserves a chance to learn and grow. We believe that this experience could be transformative for you. Robert looked from James to Sarah, then to young Jacob, who was watching the exchange with curious eyes. He felt overwhelmed by their generosity and the opportunity they were presenting him. I'm truly honored by your offer, Robert said, his voice thick with emotion. But I'm not sure I'm worthy of such a chance. James placed a gentle hand on Robert's shoulder. Mr. Hughes, worthiness isn't about what you've done in the past. It's about what you choose to do moving forward. We're offering you a chance to be part of something bigger than yourself, to make a real difference in people's lives. Robert stood there, his eyes welling with tears. The Carter family's kindness and forgiveness touched him deeply, stirring something within his heart that he hadn't felt in years. I don't know how to thank you, Robert said, his voice trembling. Your offer is more than I deserve, but if you'll have me, I'd be honored to help with your foundation. James smiled warmly and extended his hand. Welcome aboard, Mr. Hughes. We're glad to have you. As Robert shook James's hand, he felt a weight lift from his shoulders. The shame and regret he had been carrying began to transform into something new, hope and determination. Sarah spoke up, her voice gentle. We have a meeting tomorrow afternoon at the community center. Would you like to join us? Robert nodded eagerly. Yes, I'd love to. Thank you. As the days passed, Robert threw himself into the foundation's work. He attended meetings, helped organize events, and even rolled up his sleeves to serve meals at the local soup kitchen. With each passing day, he felt his perspective shifting. One afternoon, as Robert helped paint a rundown community center alongside James, he paused and looked around. He saw people from all walks of life working together, laughing, and supporting one another. It was a far cry from the exclusive world he had once prized. You know, James, Robert said, wiping sweat from his brow. I used to think success was all about how much money you had or how important you seemed. But now I see things differently. James nodded, encouraging him to continue. I realize now that true success isn't about what you have, Robert continued, his voice filled with emotion. It's about the impact you have on others. It's about making a difference in people's lives. James smiled, patting Robert on the back. That's a valuable lesson, Robert, and you're right. The most fulfilling success comes from lifting others up, not looking down on them. As Robert continued to work with the foundation, he found himself viewing the world through a new lens. He began to see the value in every person he met, regardless of their background or status. Compassion replaced competition in his heart, and he discovered a sense of fulfillment he had never known before. As Robert became more involved in the foundation's work, he found himself spending more time with the Carter family. Their kindness and wisdom began to chip away at the walls he had built around himself. One sunny morning, Robert joined Sarah Carter at a job training program for single mothers. As he helped set up chairs for the workshop, he overheard a young woman named Lisa talking about her struggles. It's not easy, Lisa said, her voice filled with determination. But I'm going to make a better life for my kids, no matter what it takes. Robert was struck by her resilience. He had never had to worry about providing for his family, and Lisa's strength humbled him. Later that week, Robert volunteered at a food bank with James. As they sorted donations, an elderly man approached them with tears in his eyes. Thank you, the man said, his voice quivering. This food, it means I can eat this week. Robert felt a lump form in his throat. He had never known true hunger, and the man's gratitude for something as simple as food touched him deeply. As the days turned into weeks, Robert found himself constantly surprised by the people he met through the foundation. He saw single parents working multiple jobs to support their children, immigrants learning English to build better lives, and teenagers tutoring younger kids to break the cycle of poverty. William pulled up a chair, uninvited. "Oh, same old, same old. I heard you've been spending time with that Carter bunch and their little charity project. What's that about?" Robert felt his jaw clench. "It's not a little charity project, William. It's a foundation that does important work for our community." William scoffed, waving his hand dismissively. "Come on, Robert. You can't be serious. Those people don't need handouts. They just need to work harder." Robert's face flushed with anger. He took a deep breath, remembering all he had learned from the Carters. "That's not true, William. The foundation helps people who are already working incredibly hard but face systemic barriers." "Systemic barriers?" William laughed mockingly. "That's just literal nonsense. You're not buying into that, are you?" Robert stood up, his voice firm. "I'm not buying into anything, William. I've seen the reality with my own eyes. The foundation's work is vital, and the people it serves are deserving of our support and respect." William's face darkened. "You've changed, Robert. What happened to you?" "I grew up, William," Robert replied, his voice steady. "I learned to see beyond my own narrow worldview. The foundation and the Carters have taught me the value of compassion and understanding." As William sputtered in disbelief, Robert felt a sense of pride wash over him. He realized in that moment just how far he had come from the man he used to be. As news of Robert's involvement with the Carter Family Foundation spread throughout the town, people began to see him in a new light. The once aloof businessman was now a regular sight at community events, rolling up his sleeves and working alongside volunteers. His genuine smile and willingness to listen to other stories touched many hearts. At the local grocery store, Mrs. Thompson, a longtime resident, whispered to her friend, "Can you believe that's the same Robert Hughes? I saw him helping at the soup kitchen last week. He was so kind to everyone." Her friend nodded in agreement. "I heard he's using his business connections to create job opportunities for those in need. It's like he's a completely different person." The change in Robert's reputation was gradual but undeniable. People who once avoided eye contact with him on the street now greeted him warmly. Local shop owners smiled when he entered, no longer seeing him as just a wealthy customer, but as a valued member of the community. At a town council meeting, Mayor Johnson praised Robert's efforts. "Mr. Hughes's dedication to our community through his work with the Carter Family Foundation is truly inspiring. He's shown us all the power of second chances and the importance of giving back." Robert's story became a topic of conversation at dinner tables across town. Parents used it to teach their children about the importance of kindness and the possibility of change. In schools, teachers shared Robert's journey as an example of personal growth and the impact of compassion. Even those who had been skeptical of Robert's transformation began to come around. Old business associates, who had initially scoffed at his new path, now approached him, curious about the foundation's work and how they too could get involved. As Robert walked down Main Street one afternoon, he was stopped by Emily, a young woman he had helped through one of the foundation's programs. With tears in her eyes, she said, "Mr. Hughes, I just wanted to thank you. Your support changed my life. You're proof that it's never too late to become a better person." Robert's story of redemption resonated deeply within the community, inspiring others to reflect on their own actions and attitudes. People began to question their prejudices and look for ways to make a positive impact in their own lives. The Carter family and Robert gathered around a large table in the foundation's office, surrounded by colorful posters and stacks of flyers. They were deep in discussion about the upcoming fundraising event, their biggest hit. "We need to make this special," James Carter said, his eyes twinkling with excitement. "Something that will really showcase what our foundation stands for." Robert nodded eagerly. "What if we held it at the community center? It's right in the heart of town, and it would show our commitment to the people we're helping." Sarah Carter smiled warmly at Robert. "That's a wonderful idea, Robert. It's perfect for bringing everyone together." As the weeks passed, Robert threw himself into the preparations. He spent long hours making phone calls, reaching out to local businesses for support, and coordinating with volunteers. His dedication was evident to everyone involved. The day of the event arrived, and the community center buzzed with activity. Colorful banners hung from the walls, and tables lined the room, each showcasing a different program the foundation supported. Robert stood at the entrance, greeting guests with a warm smile and a firm handshake. Many were surprised to see the former aloof millionaire so engaged and passionate about the cause. "Robert, I hardly recognized you," exclaimed Mrs. Johnson, a longtime resident. "You seem so different." Robert's eyes crinkled as he smiled. "I feel different, Mrs. Johnson. This foundation has changed my life in ways I never expected." As the evening progressed, Robert took to the stage to address the crowd. His voice trembled slightly with emotion as he spoke about the foundation's work and the impact it had on his own life. "Before I met the Carters, I thought success was measured by the size of your bank account," he admitted. "But now I know true success comes from the lives you touch and the good you do for others." The audience listened intently, many nodding in agreement. When Robert finished his speech, the room erupted in applause. People approached him afterward, praising his sincerity, and as the night drew to a close, it was clear the event had been a resounding success. The foundation had raised more money than they had ever hoped for, ensuring they could expand their programs and help even more people in need. James Carter clapped Robert on the back, his eyes shining with pride. "You did it, Robert. Your hard work made this possible." Robert felt a warmth spread through his chest. For the first time in his life, he felt truly fulfilled, knowing that his efforts were making a real difference in people's lives. As the last guests filtered out of the community center, Robert stood by the exit, shaking hands and exchanging warm goodbyes. The evening had been a whirlwind of activity, laughter, and heartfelt moments. Now, as the room grew quiet, Robert found himself alone with his thoughts. He walked slowly through the hall, his footsteps echoing in the empty space. Colorful banners still hung from the walls, reminding him of the night's success. Robert paused by a display showcasing photos of the foundation's work, smiling faces of children in new schools, elderly folks receiving care, and families moving into their first homes. As he gazed at the images, Robert's mind drifted back to that fateful night at the Golden Plate. He could still hear the echo of his own mocking laughter, see the hurt in the eyes of the Carter family. The memory made him wince, but it also filled him with a profound sense of gratitude for how far he had come. "What a journey," Robert whispered to himself, shaking his head in wonder. He made his way to a nearby chair and sat down, letting out a deep sigh. The weight of the evening's success settled over him like a warm blanket. Robert closed his eyes, feeling a sense of peace he had never known in his previous life of wealth and arrogance. In this quiet moment, Robert realized that he had found something far more valuable than any material possession, a true sense of purpose. The joy he felt from helping others, from seeing lives transformed, was beyond anything he had experienced before. A gentle hand on his shoulder startled him from his reverie. Robert looked up to see James Carter smiling down at him. "Quite a night, wasn't it?" James said, his voice filled with pride and warmth. Robert nodded, his eyes glistening with unshed tears of joy. "I never imagined I could feel this fulfilled," he admitted. Thank you, James. You and your family gave me a second chance when I didn't deserve one. James squeezed Robert's shoulder. You've more than earned it, my friend. The man you've become is someone to be admired. As they stood together, looking out over the remnants of the successful event, Robert felt a deep sense of belonging. He was no longer the outsider, the arrogant businessman looking down on others. He was part of something bigger, something meaningful. Robert turned to face James, his eyes brimming with emotion. James, I can't thank you enough for giving me this chance, he said, his voice thick with gratitude. You and your family showed me kindness when I least deserved it. You've changed my life in ways I never thought possible. James smiled warmly, placing a hand on Robert's shoulder. Robert, the change came from within you. We merely opened a door. You chose to walk through it. Robert shook his head, overwhelmed by James's humility. But you saw something in me that I couldn't see in myself. You believed in me when I was at my worst. That's what this foundation is all about, James replied. Seeing the potential in people and giving them the opportunity to grow. And you, my friend, have grown in ways that make us all proud. Robert's eyes widened. Really? You're proud of me? James nodded, his expression serious. More than you know. The impact you've had on this community is immeasurable. You've inspired others to give back, to look beyond themselves. That's a powerful thing, Robert. Robert felt a lump form in his throat. He had never expected to hear such words, especially from a man he had once treated so poorly. I never knew life could be this fulfilling, he admitted. The lessons I've learned from you and your family, they've changed everything for me. James's eyes crinkled with understanding. That's the beauty of compassion and forgiveness, Robert. They have the power to transform lives, not just the lives of those we help, but our own as well. The two men stood in comfortable silence for a moment, both reflecting on the journey that had brought them to this point. Robert felt a deep sense of respect and admiration for James, a feeling that was clearly mutual. You know, James said softly, when we first met, I never would have imagined we'd be standing here as friends. But I'm grateful for it, Robert. Truly grateful. Robert nodded, unable to speak past the emotion clogging his throat. He reached out and grasped James's hand, giving it a firm shake. In that handshake was a world of understanding, respect, and friendship, a bond forged through adversity and strengthened by shared purpose. Robert continued his work with the Carter Family Foundation, pouring his heart and soul into every project. As the months passed, he found himself reflecting on the incredible journey that had brought him to this point. The man he once was seemed like a distant memory, replaced by someone who valued equality, humility, and compassion above all else. The Carter family watched with pride as Robert's dedication to the cause never wavered. They saw the profound changes in his character, marveling at how far he had come from that fateful night at the Golden Plate. Robert's transformation is truly remarkable, Sarah Carter commented to her husband one evening. He's become such an integral part of our work. James nodded in agreement. It's inspiring to see how he's embraced our mission. He's not just talking the talk, he's walking the walk every single day. As Robert's passion for the foundation grew, so did his influence. His friends and acquaintances in his old social circle began to take notice of the changes in him. Many were intrigued by the fulfillment they saw in Robert's eyes and the purpose that seemed to drive him. One afternoon, while Robert was leading a foundation meeting, he encountered a young man sitting on a bench outside, looking dejected. The sight reminded Robert of the many people he had helped through the foundation's work. Are you all right? Robert asked, approaching the young man. The young man, who introduced himself as Alex, explained that he was struggling financially and felt lost about his future. Instead of simply offering a donation, Robert felt compelled to do more. Why don't we grab a coffee? Robert suggested. I'd like to hear more about your situation. Over the next hour, Robert listened intently to Alex's story. He saw in the young man a reflection of the people he had been helping through the foundation, but also a bit of his former self, someone who needed guidance and a fresh perspective. Alex, Robert said, leaning forward, I want to help you, but not just with money. I'd like to mentor you if you're open to it. There's so much potential in you, and I believe with some guidance and hard work, you can overcome these challenges. Alex's eyes widened with surprise and gratitude. Really? You'd do that for me? Robert smiled warmly. Of course. I've learned that true fulfillment comes from helping others. Let's meet regularly, and I'll share what I've learned about hard work, perseverance, and making the most of opportunities. Over the next few months, Robert mentored Alex, guiding him through job applications, financial planning, and personal development. As Alex's situation improved, Robert felt a deep sense of satisfaction, knowing he had made a real difference in someone's life. At the next major foundation event, Robert stood on stage, looking out at the sea of faces before him. The room was filled with people whose lives had been touched by the Carter Family Foundation's work. Robert's heart swelled with emotion as he began to speak. A year ago, I was a different man, he began, his voice filled with sincerity. I was blinded by my own prejudices and misconceptions. But thanks to the kindness and wisdom of the Carter family, I've learned the true value of compassion and equality. As Robert continued his speech, he saw familiar faces in the crowd, people he had worked with, volunteers he had recruited, and even Alex, sitting proudly in the audience. Each person represented a life changed, a story of hope and perseverance. Today, I stand before you not as a wealthy businessman, but as a humble servant to our community, Robert said, his voice filled with conviction. I reject discrimination and prejudice in all forms, and I commit myself fully to the work of this foundation. The applause that followed was thunderous. As Robert stepped down from the stage, he was surrounded by well-wishers and people sharing their stories of how the foundation had helped them. In that moment, Robert felt a profound sense of fulfillment, knowing that his transformation had rippled out to touch countless lives.